Hi. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Julia Klein. I'm the publisher of Soberscove Press, and we're going to talk about the role that books play in sharing artists' legacies, in particular books that present archival and other documentary materials of under-recognized historical artists. I've been doing Soberscove for about 15 years, and over the years that the press has evolved in such a way that I've done a number of books that fall under this umbrella. I'm interested in getting to know artists through the stuff around their work. So for example, I worked with Jarrett Earnest on publishing a collection of writings by the artist Jessie Murray, and with Marie Warsh, published a journal kept by her aunt, the artist Rosemary, as well as a book that documents a group of ephemeral performance artworks and performances that Rosemary did in the 70s and 80s. I've thought a lot over the years about how to understand and articulate my interest in and the value of publishing this type of material, and lately what I've been thinking about is the potential that approaching an artist through a tight frame can offer in terms of reorienting and understanding their work, and how this is even more powerful for artists who aren't widely known and about whom a kind of default general story hasn't already solidified. I don't think I even heard the phrase legacy work until several years ago, which is probably right about when I learned about Soft Network, but it resonated, and now Soberscove has just begun a new co-publication series with Soft Network, whose mission is to bringing attention and support to the work of stewarding artist legacies. As we were working on this Susan Brockman's Soft Network 01, which is a book about Susan Brockman and Soft Network's Artist in Residence program, then Marie and I kept having conversations about the value, kind of along the lines of what I've been thinking about, the value that books play in promoting artist legacies, and in particular the books that we had worked on that present these documentary materials, and thinking about why these books seem to connect with artists so much, and why they're important for us as people who came to the work for very different reasons. So in an eagerness to try to understand more and continue the conversation, we came up with the idea of a panel and invited these fine people who accepted our invitation. So let me introduce everyone, and then we can get right to the discussion. Yona Backer is a cultural producer with over 25 years of experience working at the intersection of contemporary art, philanthropy, and social justice. She is the founder of Third Streaming, a global consultancy supporting artists, foundations, and arts organizations through legacy stewardship, curatorial strategy, and cultural programming. Backer has played a key role in advancing the legacy of photographer Alvin Baltrop, including co-curating his first major retrospective and shaping the long-term vision of his estate. She previously served as a program officer at the Andy Warhol Foundation, holds degrees from Hunter College and Columbia University, and is a graduate of the Aspen Institute's Artist Endowed Foundations Initiative. Jarrett Earnest is a writer, curator, educator, and the author of What It Means to Write About Art, Interviews with Art Critics, 2018, and Valid Until Sunset, 2023, and the co-host of Angelic Transmissions, an art talk show on East Village Radio. He edited and wrote the introductions to Hot, Cold, Heavy, Light, 100 Art Writings, 1988 to 2017 by Peter Schjeldahl, published in 2019, The Young and Evil, Queer Modernism in New York, 1930 to 1955, published in 2020, Painting is a Supreme Fiction, Writings by Jessie Murray, 1980 to 1993, published in 2021, Devotion, Today's Future Becomes Tomorrow's Archive, 2022, and Faint of Heart, Art Writings, 1982 to 2002 by Dave Hickey, published in 2024.
That's a lot.
And he's received many honors, including the Dorothea and Leo Rafkin Prize for Journal Arts, Visual Arts Journalism. Marie Warsh is an art historian and writer. She is co-director of the estate of Rosemary with her brother Max. She has helped to organize numerous exhibitions of Mayer's work and has edited several books, including excerpts from the 1971 Journal of Rosemary Mayer, 2016 and 2020, Beware of All Definitions, 2017, Temporary Monuments, work by Rosemary Mayer, 1977 to 1982. 2018 with Max Warsh, and the Letters of Bernadette and Rosemary Mayer, 2022 with Jillian Sneed. Since 2023, she has been involved with Soft Network, an organization focused on artists' legacies and helping to empower and support under-resourced estates and archives. She is currently the deputy director there. Warsh has also written widely on the history of parks, playgrounds, and other landscapes, and is the author of Central Park's Adventure-Style Playgrounds, Renewal of a Mid-Century Legacy, 2019. We wanted to start at the beginning and ask you all what started you on the path of thinking about books and legacy. Was there a particular project or a point at which your interest in this realm kind of crystallized?
Should I start talking about our collaboration?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Which Julia's already mentioned that we collaborated on a couple of Rosemary Mayer books. But I feel like the way in which we met is sort of a great example of this idea of these books as messages in a bottle, which is the title of the panel, which is something that Jarrett has talked about, books and legacy. The first show that we did of Rosemary's work, we did a kind of self-published publication with the gallery, but it was like a very inexpensively produced selection of Rosemary's diaries from 1971. And this was a time where very few people knew about Rosemary. It wasn't, she just wasn't widely known, and we made this publication as a kind of way to introduce Rosemary as a person as part of doing an exhibition. And this is a book that a mutual friend of ours and Julia's got the book, and Julia saw the book and then was really excited about the book and then found us. And then we collaborated on making this book, the Temporary Monuments book. And this is still a period when Rosemary was not very well known. But what this book did, this is the book about some of her ephemeral projects. This book made its way out into the world, and curators, other art historians, and all these other people encountered this book. And through this book, we ended up, all these other projects kind of came from this book and from people's encounters with this book. So I feel like this book has been super important to this idea and the idea of the book as sort of a way to promote an artist's legacy.
Can I ask a follow-up question? That it relates, I just kind of want to restate your question, but it's something I'm very interested in both the cases of you, Marie, and Yona, which is why? Why are you working on devoting all this energy to Rosemary Mayer? And on your case, it seems like there's an obvious answer. It's your aunt. But that's not actually an answer, because you could just easily not do that. So what is it that connected you to take on the work of this incredible legacy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I think, I grew up with Rosemary. We were all really close. She didn't have any children, but me and my sister and brother all spent a lot of time with her. She was very influential to kind of our way of thinking and being in the world. And she was always making art when we were growing up, but she, wasn't really that engaged in the art world. She didn't have a lot of, kind of public success or traditional success after the mid-1980s, but she was always making stuff. And, we would just see different things around her studio that were evidence of these large fabric sculptures she had made in the 70s, and, we're interested in them. And at the end of her life, towards the end of her life, we started organizing some of this stuff and just really felt it was important to get it out in the world again. And then after she died, we kind of really started working on that a little harder. But I think, we just felt like the work was really important and that it would be of interest to a broader public. And, again, I think as I work on this more, the more I realize how I'm interested in so many of the ideas that are inherent in Rosemary's work in part because she really influenced my trajectory as a thinker and an art historian. And so many of the things I'm kind of interested in are really kind of present in this. So it sort of reinforces things that I'm interested in as well. It's not just, I mean, people often say, like, you're such a dutiful niece, but it's not about a sense of duty. It's about feeling really connected to a lot of the ideas that she was working with, and getting really interested in this idea of legacy and the legacy of these artists that are under-recognized and were kind of underappreciated in their time, and the kind of challenges of trying to get them out in the world again. I've gotten really like interested in that as a challenge, like more broadly beyond Rosemary.
Cool.
My story is very different because I didn't even know Alvin Baltrop. He himself had no family when he passed away. And when he passed away in 2004, and a friend of his who was younger and an artist in his own right had gotten to know him and helped him at the end of his life when he was diagnosed with cancer, which is ultimately what he died of, to put a will together. And that was kind of it, honestly. There was nothing prepared. And so in 2008, when I was still working at the Andy Warhol Foundation, a mutual friend of ours, curator named Omar Lopez Shahood, asked me if I would meet this friend of Omar's who was taking care of this estate but really didn't know what to do. It can be extremely overwhelming. So I said, sure, I'll meet with him, and I went to, I think it was Bushwick, to his apartment, and there were bins everywhere, in manila envelopes, in Dwayne Reed plastic bags, like nothing properly conserved. But the work just blew me away, and I couldn't believe how this New York photographer was completely unknown, completely unknown. So initially my involvement was just to help Randall. I helped him get a lawyer to do pro bono work, and I just gave him advice. And then when I left the Andy Warhol Foundation, it's a long answer to your question, but it's coming, because it's just a very unusual situation. I opened a space in Soho called Third Streaming, and it was an experimental performance and exhibition space that I ran for 5 years. And when I opened it, Randall asked me if I would be interested in co-curating a show of Alvin's, who had never shown during his lifetime. And so I said, yeah, let's do it. And we did, and it was overwhelming, the response. We got a lot of reviews, a lot of press. I'd never had so many people come through the gallery or the space. And then that was kind of my beginning of the involvement. And then as time went by, Randall was running the trust, kept on asking me to do more, because I had the space to store the work. I had everything framed. He didn't have space nor the resources. So that's how I initially got involved, was just helping. But then Randall just kind of handed it over to me. And I just felt a deep commitment. I don't even know if commitment is the right word, but I just felt so strongly that this artist needed to be known, that the work deserved it. And I knew it wasn't just me who thought the work was good. There were curators like Douglas Crimp, Lynn Cook, who had, the curator at the Whitney, who's been there forever, photography curator, I'm just blanking on it, Elizabeth Sussman. All these people were really, had also gotten to know the work around the same time I had, but were starting to write about the work and include it in group exhibitions. So I knew I wasn't crazy, thinking that the work was merited to be not only preserved, but also known and part of the art history canon, because unfortunately we do have to deal with the structures and the systems in society. And he himself really wanted to be in the art world. He was just, quite frankly, very rudely denied, partly because he was an African-American man, but partly because the work was so raw. I don't know if you're familiar with the work, but it's Most of it was taken, the work that he's best known for was taken early 70s through mid 80s at the Piers, where David Hammond's Day's End is, by the Whitney. And that's where a lot of, quote unquote clandestine things happened. And he was part of that community. And so there's many, many photographs that he took. Initially, he said he went there as a voyeur to just document what was going on there, but then he became a participant, and he became friends with a lot of the people who were regulars there. And I think Alvin was a storyteller, and he cared about people, and so I think denying visibility to an artist like that is also denying recognition of an entire subculture that was a big part of New York that doesn't exist anymore. And it's not for nostalgic reasons, but there was so much creativity happening there, sexual liberation, gay liberation, that it played a role, certainly with Stonewall. And so I now feel like a weird psychic connection with Alvin. So it's, I don't know, it kind of gets into your DNA.
I wanted to know about the woo-woo part.
Yeah, it does get into your DNA. And it's not like I'm channeling Alvin, but I do want to honor him. And I have to say it's come at a personal sacrifice, because it's very expensive to take care of an artist's legacy. And in this case, there were no assets, and the work itself was the asset, but it had no value because there was no market for his work. And the work wasn't inventoried. Like I said, it was not stored. He didn't care about how it was stored, because there was video interviews with him. He liked it to be handled and everything, but when you're taking care of an artist's work, you do have to make sure that everything's properly stored and et cetera. And because he wasn't showing during his lifetime, he didn't print a lot of work, he didn't have a lot of money, and so I also really wanted to make sure that all the negatives, there's roughly 40,000 of them, he printed less than 5% of the work, that was digitized, not only for preservation reasons, but also so we can really understand the breadth and depth of his work. And eventually everything is going to go to an institution, because I'm not an institution, but I wasn't sure if an institution was gonna prioritize digitizing Alvin's work. It's a $300,000 project. So I've been doing that. And to just circle back to the books, books for Alvin were critical, because nobody knew his work. And when I had the show at my space, curator named Valerie Cassell Oliver, who was at the time chief curator at the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, came to see the show and also was blown away by the work, and immediately decided to do a show. And it was part of a series they typically dedicated to emerging artists, and usually with a little brochure, something like this. But Bill Arning was director at the time. He fell in love with the work, and they decided to actually do a proper publication. It was paperback. It was fairly skinny, but it was the first monogram ever, and I couldn't believe it, but it sold out. And it really helped. That initial publication really helped get the word out. And so books are critical, and I always knew that, just working initially as a curator, and then at Warhol, where, we would support many exhibitions by artists who were well-known, but also by artists who had been overlooked. And if a proposal came to us without a publication involved, accompanying it, we were either going to ask if it was an artist that we thought merited, like, is there not going to be a publication? It just seems so critical. So I think for me it was never an issue. Like, for me, publications have always been that it's an object that lasts. You can pick it up and read again, whereas an exhibition opens and then it ends. So it has a limited lifespan. Yeah, and I'm very excited to see the negatives, because we're going to digitize positives as well, because there's going to be several publications in there, I'm sure. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Could you pull up the image of the book that you and I did together? My answer to this question is basically, I mean, I have a slightly different perspective because I write about art and I function in public advocating for art. I think that's my job. And I don't think it's enough. I think every week, every season, we see these announcements of forgotten painter from 1945 or whatever, and it's and you know what? It's
Yeah.
That isn't enough for why
Yeah.
I should pay attention to it. So why should I pay attention to it? And I think my job is to make that argument for the things that I believe in. To me, art is about ideas above all else. It's about a way of being in the world. And I think it is not an accident, as I was listening to you both talk, that these are both the appeal and the hunger for the materials around these artists has to do with people that were either not in the art world but made their work or withdrew from the art world. And I think it says a lot about the way people feel about the conditions of the present art world, of trying to figure out how to make a life, making work that isn't being a really low-level professional PTA member or whatever. You know what I mean? It sucks. And so I think there's something about what we're looking for, what we respond to in these artists' work from the past that we're trying to draw forward as an example of something that is presently useful, to change the world. So with this artist, this is an artist that literally no one had heard of when we did this project. And I had only heard of him because he was Lisa Yuskavich's best friend in art school, and Lisa Yuskavich is one of my best friends. And every time I would go to her studio, from the time I met her, the first time I met her, she was talking about her friend Jesse Murray, who died of AIDS and who was a big influence on her. And he was a poet and a critic and a painter. And she had a little poster from his funeral, tacked on her, a program tacked on her thing. She always talked about him. So I always knew about Jesse Murray as this kind of mythological character. And then there was an opportunity and that he was a writer, and that she had a box of Xeroxes of all of his writing that she made when he died that was in her studio, and she took it to every studio, but she had never opened it. And that I could look at it if I wanted. And so there was a show that was coming up at David Zwirner that was about artists who died of AIDS, these little capsule shows. And they had asked one of the directors there who had heard her beat the drum for Jesse, and she had tried to get people to look at Jesse's work for 30 years. Nobody was interested. And so they had said, well, you're always talking about Jesse, would you consider doing one of these little shows? This show was called More Life. And so Lisa was like, yes, but I'm not a curator. I want to do it with Jarrett. So we were on it together. And so in my due diligence, I opened the box, sit down to read the writing, and I was blown away. It was so brilliant it was this kind of philosophically rigorous alternative way of thinking about the purpose of painting and its transition from a certain trajectory from Romanticism through modernism into the present at this time, the 80s. He died in 93. And how to put it all together as a black man who was gay, who grew up very poor, and who art literally saved his life. An angel came down when he was a child and was art. And how did it do that? Through books in the library. So it was so clear to me that in order to do this little show, we had to do a book of the writing. He wrote criticism, and did panel discussions. We transcribed this panel discussion that was recorded from the 80s that was moderated by Jesse about the legacy of Expressionism, for which Anna Mendieta is one of the panelists, and they have this beautiful exchange and put it all together. And then his diaries, and then there are these these poems that he started writing as he was dying, and they're the last things that he wrote. And so we put them all together in a book. And I had known Julia through work admiring greatly the books that you did. And over the years, I'd kind of always wanted to work on something with you and would send something your way, and you'd say, it's not quite right. And I never felt bad about it, because I always knew that the thing that was right would be the right thing. And so I sent you this essay that Jesse Murray went to Yale slightly later, and he studied with Harold Bloom, and that's also when he found out that he had HIV, and he was obsessed with Wallace Stevens, the famous Wallace Stevens. The title is a riff on Wallace Stevens. Poetry is the supreme fiction. And so he wrote this essay as his thesis for Harold Bloom about his relationship to painting and Wallace Stevens, and called Painting is a Supreme Fiction. I think I sent you that, or did I send you his diaries? I don't remember, his notebooks. But anyways,
I was pretty excited even before I started reading the writings.
you just immediately were like, yes, let's do it. And I was like, great, the show's in 6 months. Or 8. It was not even 8.
Yeah. And it
And
seemed
you-
like it was going to be easy.
And
It
you
seemed
were
like
like,
it was gonna
yeah,
be
we
an
can
easy
do it.
project.
And I also love that. I like this fast. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever worked on in terms of just around the clock, transcribing things from complicated handwriting things and putting it together. But what I will say is that just the presence of this book, as you both have said, was transformative. It has gone around the world. People I do not know teach with it and have told me how much it means to them. Curators in Europe have written about wanting to do things with Jesse Murray. We ultimately were able to create a Jesse Murray Foundation, because he also didn't have a family. He was estranged from his family, and we couldn't contact them anyways. His partner, who was with him when he died, is still alive, who lives in North Carolina. I worked very closely with him. And now, actually, I'm happy to say that the Getty has accepted Jesse's papers.
Wow.
And so it was a lot of work. And it was all from this little book, basically. And so that's whenever we're talking about message in a bottle, is it's just like these books, especially if they speak to something that people need, they will find them. And then they can do their work in the world. Like, I've worked on real fancy art books I've never heard a fucking thing about, I will tell you. And they're good. You know what? They're good books, good writing, but they don't have the impact that books like this have. So.
Well, I would say, so Messages in a Bottle, the title came out of a conversation that Jarrett did with Gabriel Ojeda Sage, who co-edited a book of his uncle's sketchbook drawings. He had never met his uncle, and he ended up with all this stuff. And Gustavo Ojeda was known for, he died of AIDS at age 30, was known for these nightscapes that didn't have anybody in them. But the book that he published, the drawings, the sketchbooks, the hundreds of pages of sketchbooks, thousands of pages of sketchbooks, were mostly people's faces and bodies. And so that was a book, like someone that I didn't know, and he proposed it, and I was like, we gotta do it. It's gonna be this thick book, and it's just tons of images. So tons of the reproductions of the sketches. And so Jarrett and Gabriel had a conversation online through printed matter, and then the conversation was transcribed and published on the Visual Aids website, and it's amazing. And in it, Jarrett is talking about devotion and why, the question he asked, why people do all of this work on behalf of the people that they love, whose work may have never been seen by anybody else, or and in it he very kindly talked about the books that I do as Messages as Bottle, and many other projects where people are doing them because they care about the materials, and they're putting it out there because they're interested in it, and as a gift to the future. You throw it out, something may happen with it, you don't know when it will happen. I guess I want to mention, say that the books that I do aren't, and I think, I don't think we knew the effect that the books would have on people about Rosemary and Jesse, that they would have, but they're because they're compelling and they're meaningful, and you do them not in order to necessarily get something, but because it's a way of being close to that person and that material, and you put it out, and what is going to happen? You know, you don't know. And the Gustavo Ojeda drawings, people find them and they mean so much to them, but he is not someone who is, you know, having exhibitions right now, but, you know, it may happen and it may not happen, but there's this beautiful entry into his work. I think there's a lot of questions that we could talk about, but I think we should dive into talking about some of the editorial decisions in the books, and like the emotional and intellectual reasons for making the decisions. I guess because we're right at painting as a free fiction, we could start here.
Well, you could just show some of the layouts.
Or you could talk through,
Yeah, so this is just like a transcription of one of Jesse's handwritten notebooks, which was titled Windows, Walls, and Dreams, which were his conception of the three metaphors or frameworks that we can relate to paintings. And the way that his notebooks were written, and I feel like this is often about artists writing. I recently wrote something about the Jack Whitten show at MoMA in the New York Review of Books, and I love his book of collected writing that was published by Hauser and Wirth. And they maintained all of the misspellings and the eccentricities of layout. And I think when I was researching that, thinking about it, I went back to Delacroix's journals and that had this introduction by Robert Motherwell. And Motherwell was saying that like these were so important to him because the way that it showed like the mind, like the living mind of an artist trying to come to terms with what they're doing. But he says this beautiful thing, which is the way that the Delacroix journals had been edited in the past for previous editions, they really cleaned them up and made them more streamlined. And he says, as if a painter doesn't consider every word they use with the seriousness with which they consider the paint on their brush. And so I loved that as like a way of approaching these kinds of books. And so what we did was transcribed the words, which was very challenging. We were literally praying to the spirit of Jesse Murray to get every word right. But then we would lay it out is within certain parameters the way that it was written in the notebook. And it had these two colors of ink, and then there's a lot of arrows and boxes and stuff, and on the sides. And you can see that this is actually like a form of thinking, which is what keeping a notebook is. It's the same way that making a painting is a form of thinking. You do something so you can see what it is outside of your mind and relate to it, you know? And so they're really beautiful. And working with the designer that Julia has, Rita, the indomitable Rita, who did this work so sensitively and so quickly. So,
yeah, I think, just
Go
to
ahead.
intersect, for me, because I'm not a publisher, I'm more a facilitator when it comes to publications, and I feel like the collaborations with the designers are so critical, because they're you can just do a very straightforward layout, and that's, if you had done that here, that would have been fine. But by honoring or trying to replicate, not duplicate, but kind of evoke the way Jesse was handwriting his things, that the designer was able to come up with a way to convey that. I'm not articulating this really well, but I think designers are key
yeah,
to
thank you for
coming up
saying
also
that.
with conceptualizing what a book can be.
In their best, for
Yeah.
sure. Sometimes, that's also, I have this is a different panel about me being angry about contemporary book design, but not these books. And then this is just the last thing to show, which is we produced the facsimile of Jesse's last poems that he wrote in the hospital, and he couldn't speak. And so he had made a note to his partner to read them out loud, what he was writing to him. Oof. And so because of the nature of that, I'm also really interested in the relationship between the hand and writing and the hand and drawing and thinking of them as drawings. And so you could see that. And then we wanted you to be able to read the words. So doing it in the facing pages. But taking the words out of the, just keeping the handwriting, not the facsimile of the page. And It's very, and that's the end of the book, yeah.
Maybe I'll go back to Rosemary now.
Sure.
Which do you?
The diary, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, so, yeah, I just also want to shout out Rita, the designer, who's
Now
also
she's Rita Skingle. She was Rita
Skingle,
Lascaro.
yeah. So
and-
Rita designed both books we worked on with
She didn't actually
Julia.
do this one.
Oh, she didn't? Oh,
Mhm.
you're right,
Yeah.
sorry. Okay. Just this one, and then also the new book we did with Soberscove. But yeah, I think design is really key, and I think, you know, my approach to some of the editorial decisions has really been motivated by, you know, wanting to kind of really include a lot of like contextual information about the documents that we're sharing and presenting in these books. And, you know, I think with artist diaries, I'm talking now about this diary of excerpts from the 1971 Journal of Rosemary Mayer, which is the first book that I did with Julia. You know, because this wasn't really an introduction to Rosemary for a lot of people, I really wanted to kind of include a lot of footnotes and contextual information, just to give people a sense, more of a sense of what she was talking about or who she was talking about. It's funny, to prepare for this, or while I was doing this, I was reading a lot of other artist diaries, and actually read Jack Whitten's journals, which I really liked, and also this Eva Hesse series of journals, I think both of them published by Hauser and Wirth. And it was interesting because the approach in those books was to actually not include any information, any background information at all, and not even an introduction, basically. And I found that like very like startling, even though these were both artists that were pretty well known. Like, just, I don't know, I maybe it was just a personal preference, but like when they're talking about Bob, you know, I want to know who Bob is, you know, like just random mentions of people. Like, I kind of want to know the background story, or what was happening before, or what was happening after. And so that was really my approach in the journal, was really to include a lot of footnotes and include a lot of information for people, and to really tell you who Bob was, or, you know. And I think then that was also a design, and then also include kind of reproductions of things as well, like direct reproductions from her journal, to include drawings she was making at the time that she's referencing in the journal. So she's writing about these two drawings in the journal, and then you have them reproduced as well. And so I'm always also interested in having a lot of archival material, photographs, you know, other things kind of surrounding all of this. And I like the back and forth between images and text.
Do you want to say something about temporary monuments?
Yeah. You can go back that. Go back.
Should we go back up to talking about some of Alvin Baltrop
Yeah,
books?
with Alvin, who, you know, as I mentioned, now there are 3 monograms. The first one was the one that the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston did in 2012, which sold out, and actually all 3 monograms completely sold out, which really surprised me, because especially with the first 2, because they came out pretty early when he was not well known. This one, like I said, it's a paperback. It was done on a fairly low budget, but the quality of the reproductions are good, and that was really important. And there's, of course, a text by the curator, Valerie Cosell, with an intro by Douglas Crimp, who was a big supporter of Alvin's, and afterward by Randall, who was the person who was a friend of Alvin's. And, you know, because we don't have that much on Alvin. Most of the people he photographed or knew died of AIDS, or are no longer with us for different reasons. And he had no family. There were some people he lived in the East Village, so there's some people who remember him from like the bars, the gay bars especially, in the East Village. So what we have are just, he didn't keep diaries, are some interviews. He also recorded conversations with his friends and lovers, many of whom are in his photographs, and those are also getting digitized right now. So that's going to be really interesting. We have a few, so there's not much of Alvin's voice, but we have some quotes. So that's why there's some quotes throughout, because I think the few quotes that are there, it's his voice, and then at least there's, you know, he's talking about why he's photographing. And this was actually published by Printed Matter. It was Emily Royston, who now goes by Every Ocean Hughes, who was, I guess, invited by Printed Matter to do an artist book of her writing, or their writing, and they were looking, and it had to do with the piers, and they were looking for images to use. And she had done a lot of research, and she wasn't really coming up with anything, they were not coming up with anything that really resonated with her writing and what she was looking for. And I don't want to speak for them, but they were looking for something that was really authentic and real and not nostalgic necessarily. And so they approached the Trust, and they did the layout of the images and everything. And that's one thing I want to mention that I learned from when I was working at the Andy Warhol Foundation is, you know, there was, the foundation got many requests for images for publications, and the foundation had a policy of never censoring what that publication or article was going to be. Like if it was negative or critical of Warhol in any way, may not be what we would have liked to have seen, but we would still, you know, provide the images because it's important that there's obviously people, if somebody is critical of a work in a negative way, but they're still willing to write about it for whatever reason, I think that's valid in its own way. So I never get involved with what people are writing unless it's factually incorrect. I do ask to read the texts and provide as much information, but how they interpret the work, I don't want to get involved. You know, I don't get involved with. And I think that's where, you know, there's a fine line between creativity and legacy work, in the sense that we don't want to restrict the way an artist's work would be interpreted or not. You know, you know what I mean? So anyway, this is a prototype that Alvin put together. He actually loved books and poetry and always wanted to publish a book of his work. And he was also a storyteller. And as you notice, the catalog that Camp published is called Glass. I don't know why I always get it confused. Glass into the blah blah blah, which is from a poem, and Ashes from a Flame is from a poem, which you can see there. These poems were written by his friends who lived on the piers. These were not written by well-known poets. We actually don't even know who wrote these poems. But Alvin knew them and knew that he liked poetry, so he gave them photographs and he got poems. And so, but his vision for this publication was not just to have the stories of the people he photographed accompany the photographs for context. Those lives of many of the people he photographed there were on the margins. Either they were homeless people, mental health people with mental health issues, teenage boys who were kicked out of their homes because of their sexual preference. Of course, there were lots of artists hanging out there too, but many of the people he photographed were the kind of outside of society, and so he gave them visibility. So we are now working with Primary Information, which is a nonprofit art publisher, and they're going to publish this book, which I'm really excited about. But unfortunately, we can't publish it the way he had envisioned it because we don't have the stories, and the people he was wanting to write about are no longer. So that's going to be a conversation with the publisher because we're in very early phases right now of obviously want to acknowledge that, but is there something we can do? I don't know yet.
Can I ask you a question, both of you?
Yeah.
On that point, one thing that is really interesting to me is like the things that we don't know and how to acknowledge that in the work that we do. Like all the things you just said about Alvin Baltrop is like, well, it's like a lot of stuff we just won't ever know.
No.
And it's like with Jesse Murray, it was like the same. It's like as
Yeah.
much as I could find out, that was basically it.
Yeah.
And so I imagine it, just because of the nature of how life works, that's also come up again and again in your work on Rosemary Mayer. So how have you confronted and figured out how to address, incorporate, honor the weight of the stuff that we can't understand?
That's a really great question, and it's a hard one. I don't know that I have an answer, but what I'm doing in the case of Alvin is digitizing through grants, obviously, because it's expensive, everything that we have, including the audio and videotapes, because that will fill in a lot of gaps. It will still not provide everything, but it's not like we can call somebody or go, there's nothing to refer to.
Yeah.
Or nobody. So I think that's important to acknowledge because people will make things up when they don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting this question is really interesting and important, and I think especially to the larger field of legacy work, because I think so much of what we do has to do with not knowing and making decisions about someone's, the most important aspect of someone's life, basically, while they're not here. And I think, I think this is sometimes the hardest part of all of this, but I also think it's like there's an expectation in the world, and especially in like scholarship, like that you're supposed to know everything, and actually like that's not possible. And I don't know, I just feel like I like to kind of acknowledge that you can't know everything, and that these decisions are being made not by Rosemary but by me, and that they're interpretive, and that this is a whole different year and time in the world, and all of this is all kind of based on kind of who's making the decisions and where we are in the world. And yeah, this is not 1971, but I think that's also why I like to provide as much contextual information as possible and like allow people kind of an ability to kind of, think about this work with a lot of background information as well. I do think we're kind of lucky as an estate because Rosemary really did well document a lot of her intentions, especially, not necessarily some of the technical details about things she was working on, but she wrote tons of journals, she had a lot of notebooks, and so literally whenever we do an exhibition or another project, I like go into the archive and try to find all of the times she's referencing the things that we are going to be working with, and oftentimes I can find some answer that can lead me to make decisions that I feel confident in. So
Sometimes you have to make a decision.
Yeah.
Well, somebody's got to make a decision.
Yeah.
I
and
read
you just
this.
do the best you can.
Yeah.
And try to get as much information to make the best decision you can. But yeah.
And it's like the decision that has to be made at that moment, and in the future, someone else will be able to make a different decision, and that's part of like the work's continued presence in the world. I read this book once that I really liked and thought it was sort of delicious and terrifying, called Keepers of the Flame, which is about the history of literary executorship, and which is like a concept that had to be invented, right? Like the idea of legacy work is something that had to be invented. But like it's a historical, it's a product of a particular historical moment. And so it's like none of these things are inevitable, like none of the answers are clear.
Yeah.
And I think it's really useful to remember that. Like, and I always wanted, I didn't always, but I thought, oh, I would love to write a book about the history of like art executorship, and but it is like the kind of book that's like where you just want to ruin all your friendships and no one wants to work with you anymore. But I think like I'm working on a similar diary book right now of the artist Hedda Stern. I would love to show some of these like little notebooks.
We didn't leave a lot of time for questions because we have about 2 minutes left.
Oh.
Really?
Yeah, but let me flip to the.
Well, all I wanted to say is that what I think the best we can do, and I see it in both of the projects that you've described, is try and ground the decisions based on what the work itself is showing you. And so as I was like editing this book of Hedda Stern's diaries for when she's in her 80s, you get to a point like 4 diaries in, like deep, where it has crossed out the words, should I date this for any posthumous reader? And then that's crossed out, and then it's dated, and then there's the entry. And I was like,
Wow.
I think that this says we can publish the book.
Yeah.
Like, I think she's thinking about it. So, all right, that's all I had to say about that.
And I think that's a good
Yeah.
conclusion as
Thank you
well.
for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoy. Go buy these books.
This is. Oh, yes. Well, Soberscove is in room M3. So I have these books that were discussed.
You have the new Soft Network book?
Forgot to bring when we have the new. I know. This is Susan
So-
Brockman's Soft Network 01, which is the first in a series of books that will document the archive and residence program of Soft Network.
Which both we have at Soft Network, which is on the ground floor in the J section.
Yeah, and you have Artist Ephemera
Yes,
Estates.
from Estates.
Have a good book fair.
Thank you. I didn't think about the fact that you're doing